Emily Carter stood at the edge of the Whitmore estate, her hands trembling as she clutched the worn strap of her second-hand duffel bag, the iron gates towering before her like something out of a world she never thought she would enter. Behind those gates stood a mansion in the heart of the Hamptons, far from anything she had ever known. She had only $24 left in her checking account, and no backup plan. Just 3 days ago, she had been let go from her internship at a busy hospital in the South Bronx. They said it was due to budget cuts, nothing personal, but the timing could not have been worse. She had no family left except her younger brother, no savings, and no way to pay the rent. Then the call came. A woman with a clipped, polished voice told her they found her through a nursing database. The offer sounded too good to be true. $6,000 a month, live-in care, meals included, full medical resources. The patient was a man in a coma, and she would be the primary caregiver. There was one condition, however. She would have to sleep in his room, because he could not be left alone. Emily had hesitated, unsure how to respond. The woman's voice remained calm but firm, adding that the family would not tolerate unreliability. Emily thought about her bank account, the fridge that held only half a loaf of bread, the shoes she had repaired twice already, and in that moment, she said yes. Now she stood in front of the gates of a life she did not belong to. A voice crackled through the intercom, asking her name. She answered, and after a pause, the gate began to open, its steel bars parting with slow authority. She stepped inside and walked down a driveway that sparkled with crushed white stone, past hedges trimmed to perfection, fountains that caught the morning light like glass, and a mansion so grand it made her feel like she had stepped into another universe. The front doors opened before she reached them. A man in a crisp black suit, tall and silver-hailed, gave her a quick nod and simply said, "Follow me." She followed him through wide hallways lined with oil paintings and polished floors that reflected every step, past staircases that curved like ribbons, and rooms so large she could not imagine how people used all that space. They entered a grand sitting room where a woman waited, seated on a cream-colored armchair with her back straight and legs crossed, wearing a tailored gray dress and pearls that spoke of old money and sharp expectations. "You are Emily?" the woman asked, her tone more a statement than a question. "Yes, ma'am," Emily replied softly. "I am Margaret Whitmore," she said. "My son Alexander is in a coma. A car accident 4 months ago. He has not spoken or moved since. The doctors say he may wake up, or he may never. Your job is to care for him, to bathe him, feed him, monitor his vitals, speak to him, and make sure he is clean and stable at all times. You will live in this house and sleep in his room. That is non-negotiable." "He cannot be left alone," Emily paused, stunned by the bluntness. "Is that a problem?" Margaret asked. Emily thought about her brother's school tuition, the eviction notice taped to her door, and the empty shelves in her kitchen. "No, ma'am," she said. Margaret gave her a hard look, then nodded once. "You start today. The nurses will show you the routine. But from this moment forward, he is your responsibility. Do not fail me." Emily followed the butler up the stairs with her heart pounding, the mansion silent around her, the air heavy with a stillness that felt almost sacred. Somewhere inside this place was a man who once ran an empire, who once graced the covers of business magazines, and who now lay silent in a bed, unseen by the world. She had no idea what to expect, but deep down, something told her that this was only the beginning. The first thing Emily noticed as she followed the butler through the upper floor was the quiet, not the kind of silence that comes from emptiness, but the kind that settles in when people are waiting for something to change. The walls were painted a soft cream, accented with gold-trimmed frames and crystal sconces, and the hallway smelt faintly of lavender and polished wood. As they walked deeper into the East Wing, her steps grew more hesitant. She had worked in hospitals before, had cared for elderly patients, even held the hand of a woman as she took her last breath. But this was different. This was not a hospital, And she was not just a nurse. She was being brought into the private, protected world of a billionaire who had vanished from public life without a trace. The butler stopped in front of a large double door, polished cherry wood with brass handles that gleamed like new. He looked at her briefly, then opened one side without a word. Emily stepped in and caught her breath. The room was massive, larger than her entire apartment. A tall window stretched from floor to ceiling, its heavy velvet curtains drawn slightly open to let in morning light. A chandelier hung from the center of the room, delicate and sparkling like a crown. To the left stood a mahogany bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes and glass cases displaying trophies and framed newspaper articles. To the right was a smaller bed, neat and simple, clearly prepared for her. But at the center, surrounded by silence and sunlight, was the bed that held Alexander Whitmore. He was lying perfectly still, his face angled slightly toward the window. His skin was pale but not unhealthy, his hair dark and neatly trimmed, his body strong beneath the soft gray shirt and white sheets. He didn't look broken, just asleep, as if he might stir at any moment. A monitor beside the bed beeped softly, showing his heart rate and oxygen levels. Tubes and wires ran discreetly from his body to a compact machine, and beside the bed stood a tray of medical supplies, freshly organized and labeled. Emily walked closer, her shoes sinking into the thick carpet, and took a long look at the man she was meant to care for. Even unconscious, he looked powerful. His jawline was sharp, his features symmetrical and clean, and there was something in the way he lay there that made her chest tighten, a strange mix of pity and curiosity. She turned slightly as a nurse entered behind her, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and quick hands. "Good morning. You must be Emily," the woman said, offering a small smile. "I'm Brenda. I've been part of Mr. Whitmore's medical team since the accident. I'll be showing you the daily routine." Emily nodded, grateful for something familiar to focus on. For the next hour, she listened carefully as Brenda walked her through everything. The schedule was strict. Morning vitals at 7, sponge bath and change of clothes by 8, gentle muscle stimulation and massages to prevent stiffness, turning him every 2 hours to avoid bed sores, checking oxygen flow, and documenting any physical reaction. Meals were through a feeding tube, carefully measured, and hydration monitored by IV. She would be responsible for every detail. Brenda made it clear that the job was serious and demanding, but that Margaret Whitmore valued loyalty above all. After Brenda left, Emily sat on the edge of her small bed and took a deep breath. The room was quiet again, except for the soft beeping of the monitor and the faint sound of birds outside. She looked over at Alexander. His chest rose and fell with mechanical consistency, his lips slightly parted. She spoke for the first time. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. "I guess this is day 1. You probably can't hear me, but I'm going to be around a while, so I'll talk anyway. It helps me feel less like I'm alone in here." She paused, watching his face for any flicker, any sign of response, but there was none. She looked around the room again. It felt frozen in time, like everything had been carefully preserved. The books on the shelves were untouched. The trophies gleamed, but no one had looked at them in months. On the nightstand beside his bed was a photo in a silver frame. It showed a younger Alexander, smiling with arms around 2 other men, maybe friends or brothers, standing in front of a yacht. He looked alive, full of energy, far from the stillness that now surrounded him. Emily lay back on her bed for a moment, letting the weight of the room settle around her. She had never slept in the same space as a patient before. It felt strange, intimate even, but necessary. This was her job now. She had accepted the terms, and in return she had a chance to support her brother, to start over, to survive. She turned her head slightly, looking again at the man in the center of the room. He was not just a patient. He was Alexander Whitmore, heir to one of the most powerful tech empires in the country. And now, for reasons she could not explain, he was also part of her story. The days passed slowly inside the Whitmore estate, each one blending into the next, measured by the soft beeping of the machines, and the quiet rustle of sheets as Emily moved through her daily routine. At first, her tasks were mechanical. She woke at 6:30 every morning, brushed her teeth, tied her hair back, and walked a few steps from her small bed to the larger one where Alexander lay. She would check his vitals, adjust the IV if needed, clean the feeding tube connection, and speak a few polite words into the silence. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she would say, even though there was never an answer. Then came the bath. It took time, more than an hour some mornings, to clean every part of him gently and thoroughly. She used warm water, soft cloths, and unscented soap, careful not to bruise his still body. At first, she avoided looking at his face for too long, feeling awkward caring for a man she had never spoken to, a man who did not even know she existed, but slowly that changed. On the 8th day, while massaging his shoulders to stimulate muscle tone, she found herself speaking without meaning to. "You know, I never thought I'd be here," she said quietly, working her thumbs into the space between his shoulder blades. "I thought I'd be working in a hospital, maybe one day in a pediatric ward. That was my dream. But dreams are expensive and rent is real." She let out a small breath, unsure if she was confessing too much. The room remained silent, unchanged. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a space shared. By the second week, talking to Alexander became part of her routine. She would tell him about the staff downstairs, how the chef was always humming jazz music, how the gardener had a daughter who wanted to be a dancer, how she used to visit her mother's grave every Sunday before moving here. Sometimes she would read to him from the books on his shelf, and other times she would just sit beside him, watching the way the sunlight traced patterns on the ceiling. There was something comforting about the stillness, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, in this quiet room, her life had found a strange kind of rhythm. Then, one morning, something changed. She was mid-bath, carefully wiping down his chest with a warm towel, when she felt it. A twitch. Just a slight one, a tiny contraction of his left pectoral muscle, so subtle she almost missed it. She froze, her hand suspended mid-air. Slowly she leaned in, eyes fixed on his face. Nothing else moved. His eyes remained closed, his breathing unchanged, his fingers still. Maybe it was just a muscle spasm, she told herself, a reflex. But still, her heart beat a little faster. The next day it happened again. This time it was a small twitch in his right leg while she was massaging it. Again, no other sign, no movement, no sound. But Emily began to feel something shift. That night, she sat on her bed with her knees pulled to her chest, watching him through the dim light. "Do you know what I wonder?" she whispered. "I wonder if you can hear me, if somewhere inside you're listening to my voice and waiting." She paused, her voice softening. "Because I think I'd wait for you if I knew you were still in there." She didn't expect anything, of course, but just saying it out loud made the air feel heavier, more real. It was on the 21st day that the first undeniable reaction occurred. Emily had just finished telling him a story from her childhood about the time her mother walked 5 miles in the rain to bring home a second-hand winter coat she had wanted, and how she cried when she realized it didn't quite fit, but wore it anyway because her mother had tried so hard. Her voice cracked as she finished the story, and she turned to Alexander with a sad smile. "I didn't even say thank you," she whispered, and by the time I wanted to, it was too late. A single tear slipped from her cheek. Then she saw it. A tear. Not hers. His. Sliding slowly from the corner of his eye and disappearing into the pillow. Emily gasped, stood up too fast, and nearly tripped over the edge of the rug. She ran to his side, her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers hovered near his cheek. She touched it. The moisture was real, not a trick of the light, not imagined. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. "Alexander?" she whispered. "Are you in there? Can you hear me?" She reached for his hand and held it tightly, her own shaking. "Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." Nothing. She closed her eyes and tried to slow her breathing. Then, just as she was about to let go, she felt it. The faintest pressure. a soft squeeze, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched his hand and leaned over him. "You're fighting, aren't you?" she said, her voice cracking. "You've been listening this whole time." She sat there for hours, holding his hand, whispering encouragement, telling him everything she had been too afraid to say before. "I don't know what this is," she murmured, "but I feel like I know you. And maybe that's crazy, but I do. You're not just some rich man in a coma to me anymore. You're something more." She didn't finish the sentence, because she didn't know what came after. She only knew that from that moment forward, everything had changed. The next morning, she reported everything to Margaret. At first, the woman stared at her with skepticism, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then Emily described the tear, the squeeze, the small movements. Margaret's face shifted, not dramatically, but enough. She didn't dismiss it. She said she would call in the neurologist. That gave Emily hope. Days passed, and Alexander continued to respond in small ways. His fingers moved when she called his name, his lips trembled when she read aloud, his breathing changed slightly when she touched his hand. The doctors confirmed that neural activity was increasing. They couldn't explain why, but they didn't need to. Emily knew why. By now, her feelings had grown stronger. She began to notice things. The way his eyelashes curled slightly at the tips, the way his lips parted just a little when he seemed to be resting deeply. She found herself wondering what his voice sounded like, what kind of man he had been before. She searched online, found interviews, articles, video clips. She watched him speak on stage about innovation and leadership. He was confident, brilliant, even charming, but also cold, controlled, untouchable. Not the man she felt now. Not the one who seemed to cry when she cried, or move when she touched his hand. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, she sat beside him and spoke without reserve. "You don't know this, but you've become the only person I talk to anymore. I don't have friends here. I don't go out. You're the one I say good morning to, the one I read to, the one I wait for." She let out a breath. "And I think I'm starting to care too much." She paused, the words sounding heavier than she expected. "It's stupid, I know. You're in a coma. You can't love someone when you're unconscious. And I can't fall for someone who doesn't even know I exist. But maybe I already have." She reached for his hand again, holding it gently. "You smell like cedarwood, and sometimes I imagine you waking up, asking me who I am, and me telling you everything from the beginning." She looked at his face. He was still sleeping, still silent, but she felt a warmth between them that made her believe the impossible. She smiled sadly. "I hope when you wake up you remember my voice. That will be enough." As she turned off the bedside lamp and walked toward her own bed, she didn't see it, but his fingers twitched again, this time stronger. Emily woke the next morning with an ache in her back and the strange sense that something in the room had shifted, though nothing looked different at first glance. The early light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm haze across the wide floor, and the familiar steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence, as it always did. She sat up slowly, glancing at the larger bed across from hers, expecting the usual stillness, but this time, as she looked closely, she noticed that Alexander's fingers were no longer resting exactly where she had left them the night before. They were curled ever so slightly, a position they had not taken on their own until now. Her heart jumped, and without thinking she got out of bed and crossed the room barefoot, kneeling beside him, watching his face for any sign that this was more than coincidence. "Morning, Mr. Whitmore," she whispered softly, as if her voice could coax him into movement. "I hope you're still fighting in there, because I am not going anywhere. Not until you open those eyes." She reached for his hand again, warming it gently in hers, waiting for a reaction. For a moment, nothing happened, but then she felt it once more. the faintest squeeze, more distinct than yesterday, and this time it came with a slight tightening around his jaw. She gasped quietly, blinking fast. "You were in there. You're coming back," she said, her voice trembling. "I knew it." The next hour felt like a blur. She called the medical team, then Margaret, who arrived in a rush, her usually composed features stiff with cautious hope. The doctors did another full scan, recorded neural activity, tracked eye movement, and concluded what Emily already felt deep in her chest. Alexander Whitmore was showing signs of consciousness. It might take days or weeks, they said, but the signals were promising. Margaret turned to Emily afterward with an expression that was hard to read, something between gratitude and wonder, but she said only 2 words before leaving the room: "Keep going." In the following days, everything began to change. Alexander's eyes fluttered more frequently, his fingers moved more deliberately, and once, when Emily leaned in to adjust his pillow, he made a faint sound in his throat, almost like a sigh. She paused, leaning closer. "Alex, if you can hear me, try again. Say something." For a long moment there was silence, but then a whisper so soft she almost thought she imagined it. "Timmy." That was what he said, or tried to say, her name, or at least the name he had begun calling her in his half-conscious state. She grabbed his hand, tears flooding her eyes. "You remember? You know me. I'm here." As the days turned into a week, Alexander began waking more often, not fully, not with clear words or long conversations, but with eye contact, with weak smiles, with movements that mirrored awareness. He followed her voice when she moved through the room, blinked in response to simple questions, and even raised his hand slightly when she asked if he was in pain. Emily found herself overwhelmed not with fear but with a deep, tender joy that grew heavier with every moment she spent by his side. It was a joy laced with something else, too, something softer and more dangerous, the kind of feeling that stayed with her even when she left the room, the kind that made her chest ache for reasons she didn't want to name. One night, after a long therapy session during which she helped him stretch and sit upright with assistance, she sat at the edge of his bed and held his hand again. "You've come so far," she whispered. "I think you're going to walk again. You're too stubborn not to." She looked at his face, the faint curve of a smile on his lips, the warmth returning to his gaze. "I used to think I was just here to help you heal, but now I'm scared that when you do wake up, fully wake up, you won't remember what we shared. You'll go back to your world, your real world, and I'll just be the nurse who kept you company while you were asleep." She didn't expect an answer, but when she looked down at his hand, he was gripping hers, gently but firmly. His eyes were open, focused, and this time there was no mistaking it. His lips moved again. "I remember your voice. I've been listening every day." Emily covered her mouth, stunned, a choked sound escaping her throat. "You heard me all this time?" He nodded slowly, weakly, but it was enough. She leaned forward, her forehead brushing his, her voice breaking. "I thought I was losing my mind, talking to you like that. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. It was the only time I felt alive." He closed his eyes, just for a second, and whispered, "Me too." The next morning, as the house buzzed with cautious celebration, Emily couldn't focus on anything else. She felt like her world had cracked open, letting in something fragile and enormous all at once. Every time she looked at Alexander now, she didn't just see a patient. She saw someone who had been there for her too, even in silence. Someone who had held on to her words like they were lifelines. It was terrifying and beautiful, and she didn't know what to do with it. But it wasn't long before the fear set in. She began to pull away slightly, afraid of what would happen next. If he got better, fully better, would he still need her? Would he still feel something for the girl who washed his hair and read to him in the dark? Or would she fade back into the background of his life, just another staff member he'd once relied on? She started speaking less, avoiding eye contact when he tried to look at her longer than usual. She kept her responses short, professional, careful. But he noticed. He always noticed. One afternoon, as she was adjusting the covers around his legs, he reached out and touched her wrist. She froze. "Timmy," he said, his voice stronger now, clearer. "Why are you pulling away?" Her heart jumped. "I'm not. You are," he said quietly, "and I don't want that." She stood still for a long moment, then stepped back. "You're healing, Alex. You're getting stronger every day. That's what matters." He watched her carefully. "That's not all that matters to me." She turned before he could say more, afraid that if she stayed, she might not be able to keep her heart quiet. That night, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to remind herself that lines existed for a reason, that this was temporary, that she was temporary. But even as she told herself all those things, she remembered his voice, cracked and quiet, saying her name like it meant something, and deep down she knew the truth. She had fallen for him, and if she wasn't careful, it would break her. Days later, she overheard part of a conversation in the hallway. Two of the nurses talking in hushed tones. They said that once Alexander regained his full strength, his old team would be returning. Assistants, advisors, friends. The life he had before would come flooding back, and with it the people who belonged to it. Emily stood behind the door, her chest tightening. They didn't say her name, but they didn't need to. She knew what it meant. So that evening she made a decision. She walked into his room, took a deep breath, and told him what she hadn't had the courage to say before. "When you're strong enough, I'll leave. You don't need to say anything. I just wanted you to know." He stared at her, pain flickering in his tired eyes. "Why?" "Because this isn't real," she said softly. "You were asleep, and I was the only voice you heard." "That's not love. That's just comfort." He tried to speak, but she raised her hand. "Please, let me finish. I'm grateful for everything, for the way you listened, for the way you made me feel seen. But we come from two different worlds, and when yours returns, you'll see it clearly again." She turned to go, not trusting herself to stay any longer. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, he said something that made her stop in her tracks. "I knew I loved you before I opened my eyes." Emily stood frozen at the doorway, her fingers still resting on the doorknob as those words echoed in her mind. Words she had not expected to hear. Words that both shattered and rebuilt her all at once. "I knew I loved you before I opened my eyes," he had said. And though part of her wanted to believe it with every fiber of her being, another part resisted, clinging to caution, to reality, to the divide that had always existed between them. She didn't turn around right away, afraid that if she saw the truth in his eyes, she might crumble completely. The room was quiet again, heavy with unspoken emotions, and finally, after what felt like a lifetime compressed into seconds, she turned to face him. Alex was sitting upright now, supported by pillows, his face pale but steady, and his eyes locked onto hers with a clarity that cut through every doubt she tried to hide behind. "You don't mean that," she said quietly, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. "You were vulnerable. I was here. It's not real." His brow furrowed, and he shook his head slowly. "You think I don't know the difference between gratitude and love?" he asked, his tone firm but not angry. "I've had people take care of me my whole life, paid staff, assistants, doctors, therapists. No one ever spoke to me like you did. No one ever stayed because they wanted to." She opened her mouth, but he raised a hand. "Let me finish. I remember your voice before anything else. I remember how you made me laugh when I couldn't even move my mouth. I remember how you sat beside me in the dark and told me stories just to keep yourself from crying. I remember how you touched my hand the night I cried for the first time and said you would wait for me. I didn't forget. I felt all of it. I didn't just fall in love with your face or your kindness. I fell in love with who you are when you think no one is watching." Emily's throat tightened, her chest rising with quick, shallow breaths as she struggled to hold back the tears that now threatened to fall. It can't work, she said, barely more than a whisper. Even if you feel that way now, it won't last. You're Alexander Whitmore. You live in a world of boardrooms and cameras and people who wear $5,000 shoes. I can't be a part of that world. You think I care about that world? You think I care about that world, huh? You think I want to go back to all that like nothing happened? I don't. Everything changed the day I woke up and saw you sitting there. You gave me something I never had, even when I had everything. She shook her head, taking a step back. I can't, she said. I can't be the girl who ruins your image or gets used for sympathy. I don't want to be a story in the tabloids. He reached for her hand then, wincing slightly from the effort, but not letting go once he caught her wrist. Then don't be, he said. Don't be the story. Be the woman who changed everything. Be the woman who stayed when I had nothing. That's not weakness. That's strength. That's love. But Emily pulled her hand away gently and walked toward the window, arms crossed over her chest, her back to him. She watched the trees swaying in the late afternoon breeze, watched a bird land on the edge of the fountain below, and wished more than anything that her heart didn't feel so heavy. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice breaking. I've spent my whole life being let go, being passed over, being told I'm not enough, and now I'm standing here, in front of someone I've come to love more than I should, and I'm terrified that once you're fully recovered, I'll be nothing but a memory you want to forget. Behind her, she heard the soft rustle of sheets, the slight wheeze of effort as Alex shifted in the bed, and then a long silence before he spoke again. Then let me prove it, he said. Give me time. Give me a chance. Don't run before I've even had a chance to walk. Literally. She turned at that, and despite herself, a faint smile tugged at her lips. He smiled too, though his was tired, his body still too weak for grand gestures. I'm not asking you to believe me today, he said. Just don't give up on me yet. She nodded slowly, not with full acceptance, but with the smallest crack in her resistance. That night she stayed in the chair beside his bed a little longer than usual. She didn't speak much, just held his hand while the room dimmed around them. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It felt like understanding. In the days that followed, Alex continued to grow stronger. He began physical therapy in the morning, first with assistance, then gradually standing with support. Emily watched his determination, the quiet fire in his eyes as he pushed through the pain, and something in her softened. She brought him his meals, helped him dress, and when she thought he wasn't looking, she smiled to herself just seeing him move again. One morning, as she helped him into his wheelchair, he looked at her and said, You know, if I ever walk down an aisle again, I'd want you at the end of it. She rolled her eyes, pretending to brush it off, but her heart skipped. You're not funny, she said. I wasn't trying to be, he replied. Then came the press. News leaked that Alexander Whitmore had awakened from his coma. Journalists camped outside the estate. Articles appeared, speculating who had cared for him during his recovery. Emily's name wasn't in any of them, but the pressure began to mount. Margaret called Emily into her office one morning and asked if she was all right. The matriarch's voice was softer now, less guarded. I know this hasn't been easy, she said, but I want you to know something. You saved my son. Emily didn't know how to respond. I only did what I was hired to do. Margaret smiled, just slightly. You did far more than that, and I see it. I may not have understood it first, but I see it now. Emily returned to her room that night with those words echoing in her mind. She sat by the window for a long time, watching the moonlight spill across the floor. When Alex called her name from the bed, she turned and walked over, sitting beside him. Do you still want to prove it? She asked. He nodded. Then start by walking. So he did. Step by step, inch by inch, he walked with her beside him. The therapy grew more intense. The steps became longer, stronger, and soon he was no longer just recovering. He was preparing for something more. One afternoon in the rose garden behind the estate, he stood without help for the first time and said, "I have something to ask you, but not yet. I want to do it when I can stand on my own 2 feet." Emily looked at him, her eyes wide. "You're serious?" He nodded, and she didn't argue. Weeks passed, and Alex was almost himself again. He began working with his staff remotely, his mind sharp, his voice calm, but the only person he really listened to was Emily. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I can't wait anymore," he said. "I've waited my whole life to meet someone who made me believe I was more than just my success, more than my name. That person is you." Emily gasped as he opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Marry me, Timmy. Not because you saved me, but because you saw me. Because you believed in me when I didn't even know who I was anymore." She stared at him, heart pounding, tears in her eyes, and then she smiled. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." The days after Emily said yes felt like something between a dream and a fragile miracle. For the first time in her life, she wasn't simply surviving but allowing herself to hope, to imagine a future where she belonged, not as an assistant, not as a caretaker, but as someone who was chosen. The ring on her finger was modest compared to the kind of jewelry she imagined the women in Alexander's old world wore, but to her it was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. He had given it to her not with grand words or a dramatic scene, but with quiet honesty, with eyes that looked directly into hers and hands that trembled just a little from the weight of meaning behind the gesture. They spent more time together in the weeks that followed, not as nurse and patient, but as 2 people trying to understand what love could look like outside of extraordinary circumstances. They sat in the garden most evenings, sharing stories they hadn't told anyone else. Alex confessed that before the accident, he had been lonely in a way that didn't make sense to the outside world, that people assumed he had everything because he had money, power, influence, but none of it felt real. And most days he walked through his life like an actor, performing a part he didn't even audition for. Emily shared pieces of her childhood she hadn't spoken aloud in years, like how she used to sit on the fire escape of her apartment in the Bronx and pretend the stars could hear her, or how her mother used to tuck handwritten notes into her lunchbox, each one ending with the same line, "You are more than the world will ever see." It felt like something was being rebuilt between them, not just a relationship, but a kind of trust neither of them had ever fully known. But even as the warmth grew, a shadow began to form at the edges of their new life, quiet but persistent, the kind that made her heart clench in moments she should have felt safe. It started with a letter, hand-delivered, no return address, just a clean white envelope with her name written in perfect cursive. Inside was a single sentence typed on a page. "You think this is real, but he'll go back to where he belongs." Emily stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her drawer without telling Alex. She didn't want to disturb the peace they had built, not over something so vague, but the words settled in her mind like a splinter. The second letter came 3 days later, this one a little less polite, a printed photo of her walking beside Alex in the garden, taken from a distance, and underneath it the words, "He's not yours, he never was." This time she couldn't pretend it didn't matter. She confronted the house staff, asked if anyone had seen anything suspicious, but everyone denied knowledge. Margaret noticed her worry and pulled her aside one morning. "You've been quiet," she said. "Is something wrong?" Emily hesitated. "I don't know. I feel like I'm being watched." Margaret studied her with narrowed eyes. "If someone's trying to intimidate you, they'll have to go through me first." But Emily wasn't convinced the threat was external. Deep inside, the part of her that had always braced for disappointment began to whisper again, reminding her that nothing this good ever lasted. It didn't help that Alex had been receiving calls again from his old life, People asking when he would return to the city, to his company, to the events and circles he had once dominated. She heard him on the phone one night, speaking in a tone she hadn't heard in weeks, sharp, focused, the voice of a man used to control. When he hung up and turned to her, she forced a smile, but inside she felt something falter. "Are you going back?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But eventually?" He looked at her carefully. "I don't know, maybe." That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed replaying everything, wondering if she had stepped too far into a world that had only opened its doors because the real one was closed. Maybe she had been a chapter during his recovery, but what if the story was supposed to move on without her? The third letter arrived the next morning, this time placed under her pillow. No envelope, just a folded page that said, "He's already making plans without you." She didn't show him the note, but she did ask casually what his team wanted from him. "They want me to come back to the board," he said. "They're discussing a press event." "And are you going?" He paused. "I haven't decided." She nodded, trying not to show how much that answer hurt. That afternoon she packed a small bag, just in case. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the garden, Alex found her sitting alone, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "What's wrong?" he asked. "You're miles away." She turned to him, her voice quiet. "I've been getting letters." He blinked. "What?" "Someone's trying to scare me," she said. "Or maybe just remind me where I stand." He stepped forward. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't want it to be true," she said. "I didn't want to believe that this world, your world, still saw me as someone who doesn't belong." His jaw tightened. "You belong with me." "Do I? Or do I just fit right now while you're still here, still healing? What happens when you're fully back? When the city calls, when your name starts trending again, when the world wants the old Alex Whitmore back?" He reached for her hand. "Then I'll tell them he's gone." "I'm not going back to who I was." She shook her head. "I want to believe that, but part of me thinks one day I'll wake up and you'll be gone, and I'll be just a memory you don't want to explain." He took a breath, then slowly got down on one knee again, though his body was still tired. "I don't know who's trying to scare you, but I'll find out. And I don't know what the world expects from me anymore, but I do know this. Every day since I woke up, I've been trying to figure out how to deserve you, and I still haven't. But I'm not letting you go. Not now. Not ever." She looked down at him, tears in her eyes. "Then why does it feel like we're already saying goodbye?" "Because we're afraid," he said. "But love doesn't run from fear. It stays." She let him hold her hand, her grip tight. "Then stay. Even when it gets hard, even when it's easier to walk away." "I will," he said. "And this time, I'll walk toward you." That night, Emily burned the letters, every single one. She watched the flames rise and fall in the old fireplace, the words turning to ash, the fear melting with them. She turned to see Alex watching her from his chair, his face calm but alert. "You okay?" he asked. "Not yet," she replied, "but I think I will be." The next morning, Margaret announced she had hired a private investigator. "We don't take threats lightly in this house," she said. Emily felt a warmth in her chest, not just from the gesture, but from the shift in how Margaret looked at her, no longer with cold scrutiny, but with something close to protectiveness. Days later, the investigator confirmed that the letters had come from someone on Alex's former communications team, a woman who believed Emily was a risk to his public image. She had acted alone, trying to scare Emily into leaving before a formal re-entry into society. Margaret fired her immediately, and Alex made a statement privately to his team. Anyone who disrespected the woman he loved would no longer be welcome in his circle. As the truth came out, Emily felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. She and Alex walked through the garden together that evening, slowly but surely, hand in hand, step by step, and though the road ahead still held unknowns, she was no longer afraid to walk it with him. The sun was beginning to set over the estate, casting a soft golden hue across the garden as Emily stood by the fountain, her fingers gently brushing the petals of a white rose in bloom. The last few weeks had been a blur, not of chaos, but of quiet changes, of steps taken not just by Alexander, but by both of them towards something neither of them had ever truly known before. She glanced toward the main house where the windows glowed with warm light, and she saw him standing inside, speaking with Margaret, his hand tucked into the pocket of his blazer, his posture relaxed in a way she hadn't seen since the day she arrived. He looked healthier now, stronger, not just physically but in spirit, and she realized that somewhere along the way, they had both stopped waiting for life to begin again, and had started living it instead. That evening, the estate gathered for a private dinner, just family, close friends, and a few of the house staff, who had become something more than employees over the months of recovery and renewal. The long wooden table was set under strings of soft lights, and candles flickered in the gentle breeze as laughter echoed across the lawn. Emily sat beside Alex, their hands occasionally brushing, their eyes meeting with the kind of silent understanding that didn't require words. At one point, Margaret stood to speak, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "I have watched my son come back to life, not just in body but in heart," she said, "and I know it is because of the woman sitting next to him." There was a pause as everyone turned to look at Emily. "You were once just a nurse hired to do a job, but you became so much more. You gave him a reason to return to us, and I will always be grateful for that." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, her fingers tightening around Alex's. After dinner, they walked together back to the garden where it had all started, where he had first told her how he felt, where they had taken the early, trembling steps into something real. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, scattered across the darkening sky, and the air was filled with the scent of night flowers and something sweeter, something like peace. Alex turned to her and said, "You know, I've thought about a lot of things these past few months, about who I was, about who I want to be, and there's only one thing I know for sure. I don't want any future that doesn't have you in it." Emily looked at him, her heart full, her fears quiet now. "I used to think I wasn't enough for you," she said softly, "but I realize now love isn't about being enough. It's about being willing, being present, and never walking away when things get hard." He reached for her hand. "Then promise me you won't walk away," she smiled. "Not even if you beg me to." They laughed quietly, their foreheads resting together for a moment, as the night wrapped around them like a soft blanket. Months later, on a warm spring afternoon, Emily stood at the end of a flower-lined aisle in a simple ivory dress, her hair swept back, her eyes shining. Alex waited for her beneath an arch of roses, dressed in a suit that didn't try too hard, his smile filled with awe. As she walked toward him, each step steady and sure, she heard her mother's words in her mind once again. "You are more than the world will ever see," and for the first time she believed it. As they exchanged vows and rings, surrounded by those who had become family, there was no fear, no doubt, only a love that had been tested and proven true, a love born in silence and nurtured through every breath, every whisper, every tear. And as they kissed, the world fell away, leaving only two hearts that had found their way home.